Imagine yourself walking a quiet Yorkshire path, carrying nothing more than a peck of beans. The night is still, and the air feels calm, yet suddenly a horse emerges from the shadows. It follows, uncomfortably close, before changing form again and again, until at last, it reveals itself as a man caught between worlds. This encounter is the opening tale in the Byland Abbey collection, written around 1400 by an anonymous monk in the margins of a manuscript. These were moral stories, guiding rather than frightening, and it all begins with something as small and ordinary as those beans. Why would anyone find beans so important? At first glance, they seem like a small thing, tucked into a rough sack and easy to overlook. But here the story begins. A man forced to carry them after his horse stumbled and broke its leg on the road. What might seem like an ordinary misfortune quickly turned into something stranger. For a medieval traveler, every bean mattered, gathered with effort, carried with care, and sometimes believed to carry hidden meanings. In parts of folk tradition, beans carried associations with the dead, making them a fitting weight for a tale that moves so close to the boundary between worlds. Picture the man setting out at dusk, the day fading as shadows stretched across the fields. The path beneath his feet was narrow, marked by stone in some places and dirt in others, leading steadily through the Yorkshire countryside. The sack on his shoulder swung rhythmically as he walked. This was the kind of journey made countless times by peasants bringing food or supplies between villages, uneventful in every way. Yet on this night, an unease crept beside him, beginning with a faint sound that grew clearer, the steady beat of hooves, always close, never passing him by. At first, there was nothing unusual about a horse. He knew their pace, their presence, and the noise their hooves made. But this one felt out of place. It pressed close, too close, its rhythm perfectly matched to his step. He could hear not only its hooves brushing the hard ground, but also its breathing, steady and intent. Horses were working animals. They belonged to someone and carried purpose. Yet this one seemed purposefully untethered. No rider followed, no sound of reins, no voice guiding it back. It was simply there, shadowing him. And then came the movements that broke the spell of familiarity. The shape at his side began to act in ways no animal should. At one moment, its head dipped unnaturally low, then jerked up, watching him with what seemed like intention. Then, to his disbelief, the horse rose partway upright, shifting its stance until it balanced on its hind legs, holding its front feet up like hands. For anyone who had known animals well, the sight would have been deeply unsettling. It was no longer behaving like a beast of burden, but like something mimicking humanity. The beans at his side drew the horse's interest, or at least it seemed so. Again and again, it edged too near the sack, its body brushing close, circling, never quite breaking off. All around was silence, except for the occasional sigh of breeze against the fields. In that narrowing world, there was only the man and the strange figure beside him, keeping pace as though tied together. Nothing else intruded, and yet the ordinary road had already shifted into the uncanny. Then the change came. The strange horse slowed, its shape giving way, as though collapsing inward. In front of the traveler, the solid form shrank and folded until it was no longer animal at all, but a bale of hay lying on the road. If the moment had ended there, it might have been startling enough. Yet the vision did not stop. The bale glowed faintly, a soft light tracing the outlines of straw, just enough to show that the most ordinary of farm things could be remade into something otherworldly. To the medieval mind, the barrier between fields, daily labor, and unseen spirits was far less firm than it is to us. A sack of beans, a broken-legged horse, or a bale of hay could become the stage for an encounter. Shapes blurred and shifted, as though familiar life bent easily into something hidden. And this was not the last of the changes that night, for the glowing bale itself was only another step in the restless unveiling of what had chosen to appear. Soon, a new form would settle before the traveler, one even harder to dismiss as chance or trick of the eye, and the strangeness of the night would take on a human voice. How many different shapes can a wandering spirit take before its purpose becomes clear? Imagine standing beside the traveler as the glowing bale of hay shifts again, its bright outline folding inward. The straw bends, compacts, and rises until the suggestion of arms, shoulders, and a face emerges from the light. Where moments before there had been only an object from the fields, there now stands the form of a man. This change is not only seen, but also heard. At first, the night carries a faint sigh, uncertain and low. Then words replace that sound, unmistakably human, spoken where no living companion walks. The voice is steady enough to be heard, close enough that the traveler knows it is meant for him. Even as the figure steadies into its likeness, the faint glow lingers about the shoulders, as though the straw has not fully released its shape. Between substance and shadow, the man remains half hidden, neither entirely present nor absent. To anyone used to a world rich in signs of faith, this mixture of the clear and the unclear would have carried its own meaning, a soul caught between life and release. Encounters like this did not surprise medieval storytellers. Spirit and form were thought to move together, not fixed, but restless. An unsettled soul slipped into shapes both familiar and strange, animal, object, or human face, never at peace, never one thing for long. Each turn of shape suggested the same message, that something unresolved held the dead in place. Here, the traveler does what any man, warned by sermons and custom, might try. Instead of fleeing, he speaks with a tool the church had given. He calls on Christ's name. In the manuscript's words, he conjures the figure in the name of Jesus, demanding to know who he is and what binds him. It is this act that steadies the moment, shifting the presence from mystery into a kind of dialogue. The answer comes simply. The ghost gives his name, a sign of identity once rooted in the same countryside. He admits that guilt holds him still, and that he cannot rest until prayers or masses are said on his behalf. He does not threaten, does not frighten with gestures. He speaks with plain words. His life is over, but his sins linger, and without help, they cannot be erased. Think of what it would mean to hear this on a quiet road. The traveler is asked not for wealth, nor for courage, but for prayer. A voice of the dead turns an ordinary man into a witness, urging him to act as messenger between worlds. It is not fear that remains, but obligation. Someone must speak to God for the soul who cannot speak for himself. For a listener, then, the moment would have been both terrifying and familiar. Ghosts in sermon stories asked again and again for the same thing, not recognition, not company, but spiritual aid. And here it was again, on a path through Yorkshire fields, spoken by a man no longer living. The road does not end with words, though. Together, the living and the dead continue along the track. But soon another boundary appears, one no confession or conjuration can erase. A stream lies ahead in the dark countryside, and it is there that the spirit halts, unable to pass further. Why should a simple stretch of water mean so much? As the path bends toward a quiet stream, its dark surface catches only fragments of sky. To the traveler, crossing is no challenge. He can step carefully, splash through, and carry on. Yet the presence at his side behaves differently. The restless figure that had shifted so many times now hesitates, holding back in a way that makes the barrier feel absolute. What unfolds is not merely hesitation, but a struggle that never moves forward. The ghost edges close to the bank, then recoils as though an unseen boundary bars the way. The traveler, watching in silence, hears the faint trickle of current over stones, while beside him the figure hovers at the edge, unable to put even 1 foot into the running water. The unseen wall is stronger than any physical force. For medieval listeners, this scene held powerful meaning. Water was not viewed as ordinary landscape, but as a sacred threshold. It carried baptismal associations of purity and cleansing, marking a separation between what belonged to God and what was still bound by sin. Many believed that souls in purgatory could not cross flowing water until their guilt was lifted through prayers or absolution offered by the living. A stream, then, was not just a natural feature of the countryside. It was a visible symbol of a spiritual divide. As the man waits, the ghost makes one final gesture. At the bank of the stream, he sets down the sack of beans he had carried across the fields. Until this point, the burden had seemed a strange companion to the night's events. Now, its placement by the water becomes his sign. He cannot continue, and the task must be left behind. The traveler, though watching closely, later admits he never sees exactly how the beans are returned to him. One moment, they lie at the edge, and the next they are back in his possession, the spirit withdrawing into shadows. This quiet mystery becomes as telling as the words spoken earlier. It shows the divide between what the dead cannot finish and what the living must carry forward. For the man on the road, understanding dawns with a kind of clarity. The encounter is not meant to frighten, but to instruct. The ghost's halted steps reveal what holds him fixed, not brute force, but the unresolved weight of sin. In medieval thought, no spirit could free itself. Release came only with the help of those still alive, through prayer, confession, or the holy rite of Mass. The traveler knows this, and instead of ignoring the plea or dismissing the burden, he accepts responsibility for what must follow. Later, he arranges the expected acts of mercy. Prayers are lifted, and masses are offered for the soul that paused at the stream's edge. These devotions, so ordinary in the life of the Church, are believed to bridge the very distance the Spirit himself could not cross. In time, the ghost's restless transformations cease, replaced by the stillness that comes with reconciliation. Let's pause here and remember that this encounter was copied into the margins of a manuscript, not as a piece of entertainment, but as guidance. The stream, the beans, and the halted steps shaped a lesson that outlasted the wanderer's journey. What follows is the question at the heart of such a tale. Was it written to cause fear along a lonely road, or was it meant to teach those who listened what their prayers could truly mean? To understand what this tale offered to its first hearers, we need to think about where it was written. The Byland ghost stories were copied by an anonymous monk onto unused folios at the back of a 12th century manuscript. They were not entertainment tucked into a book, but what scholars call exempla. short moral anecdotes often used in sermons. That frame alone tells us something. The story of the traveler and the ghost was meant as guidance, kept alive within a devotional setting, rather than shared for thrills. Imagine the monk at work, pen moving across a page, already holding older texts. In the margins and blank spaces, these smaller tales found a place. That setting gave them weight because they sat beside sacred writing. When a ghost appeared in those lines, it did not haunt for its own sake. It asked readers or listeners to consider what obligations remained between the living and the dead. Stored within books used for study and devotion, the stories became memory aids and moral reminders rather than simple curiosities. To people of the late Middle Ages, none of this felt out of place. The world was understood as shared between natural and supernatural. Daily work in the fields, care for family, and the rhythm of worship all belonged within one continuous reality. Death was close, prayer was constant, and the thought that souls might pause on their journey until the living spoke on their behalf was deeply familiar. The ghost by the river would not have been heard as a creature of horror, but as a reminder in narrative form of truths already preached in church. The choice of details made the lesson memorable. Beans, for instance, represented daily sustenance. To grow, store, and carry them meant survival across a hard winter. In some strands of folk belief, beans also carried associations with the dead, which gave them an added resonance when a restlessly wandering spirit shared the burden. The stream, meanwhile, symbolized a more profound divide. Medieval listeners linked living water to baptism and purity, so a ghost stalled at the edge of it showed at once the consequence of sin and the possibility of cleansing through ritual help. By joining such ordinary signs with spiritual meaning, the tale made its point clear. The man on the road did not meet an enemy that tried to harm him. He met a soul in need of care, one who could not go further unaided. And from the moment the traveler promised to act, the responsibility passed to him, and through him to all who heard the story afterward. That was the heart of these ghostly episodes. They framed the living's duty toward the dead, where prayer and ritual were themselves acts of compassion. This practical message mattered in everyday life. Families prayed after deaths, priests offered masses, and neighbors carried intercessions in the hope of easing a soul's passage. If those prayers were lacking, the consequence was imagined as lingering unrest. So the story of the spirit asking for help was less a rare encounter than a vivid reminder. No one should neglect such obligations, because the peace of another soul might depend on it. Even the tone of the account reflects compassion. The ghost does not threaten or terrify, but pleads with plain words. That gentleness pushes the listener to empathy rather than dread. It suggests that faith stretched beyond personal salvation. It demanded thought for others. A whispered prayer counted, even if the soul in need was someone long forgotten or never known. Scholars who rediscovered these margins have noted this blend of atmosphere and moral teaching. In the early 20th century, M.R. James prepared the Latin text of the Byland Tales, and A.J. Grant offered an English translation, making them more widely known beyond specialist circles. That work lifted the stories back into memory, reminding us that their first purpose lay not in fear, but in teaching reverence, care, and shared responsibility across the boundary of death. And so the listener, whether in a monk's refectory or centuries later today, would carry away the quiet echo of the tale. A soul waiting at the side of a stream, a traveler pausing with the weight of beans, and the urging voice of one who wished for prayer. Together, these images shaped a lesson that lingers, one that suggests forgiveness and care can reach even where footsteps cannot. In their patient silence, the Byland stories remind us that the boundary between the living and the dead was never imagined as final, but as a point where kindness could still cross. The presence that once shifted forms along the path leaves more than a memory of strangeness. It leaves a sense of how forgiveness, carried in prayer, was thought to move further than death itself. The ghost that shifted from horse to hay to man leaves an image that does not fade easily. And at the quiet river where he stopped, the heart of the tale becomes clear. Even the strangest encounter asked the living to remember mercy through prayer. One gentle act, offered on behalf of another, was imagined to bring rest where unrest remained. Perhaps that is the lesson tucked into the margins of Byland Abbey's manuscript. As the slow sound of water lingers in your thoughts, let it guide you toward rest. And if you found calm in this story, consider liking or subscribing to hear more, told in this quiet way.